great to be at Kellogg, and I must admit, I actually have been invited to this before, but for whatever reasons in my schedule, I haven't been able to make it. So I'm incredibly humbled and honored actually to be here today. Thank Jamie and thank Jason actually for making the introduction for me to the work that you're doing. And I do think that from an outsider's perspective, the field certainly is moving. The social sector is certainly moving. The government sector is moving. Business is moving. There's a whole bunch of shifts that are happening. And I actually think a lot of it has come out of what's happened here for a long period of time. I think Kellogg was thinking about it long before other folks were thinking about it, and Kellogg was acting on it, one, by having this conference, long before a lot of other folks started to convene and then mobilize the resources that they have internally and externally to try to make both the student body and ultimately, because of that, the communities that we live and operate in better. What I want to talk about very briefly and then engage into a conversation is, having built KaBOOM, I want to talk about why I do what I do. I want to talk a little bit about what makes KaBOOM different. And then I want to address you a little bit about what you can do from some of the experiences that I've had in turning your kind of purpose and passion into an enterprise like myself, or making something else better. So I do what I do because when I was 2 years old, my mother gave birth to my younger sister, and she was the 8 of us Hammond kids. And my father was a cross-country truck driver. And after 2 years of raising 8 kids, my father went to unload a truck and never came back to leave my mother to care for all of us. And as hard as she tried, she had a nervous breakdown. And we became wards of the court, and I got shipped to a group home from Idaho to just outside here in Chicago called Mooseheart. And for 14 years, I was raised by philanthropy. I was raised by nameless, faceless people who did not know who I was as an individual, or frankly, even my story, talking about that emotional connection, but gave 10 cents a day or $35 a year to the Moose organization in what they call the Big Charity Dollar, that supported now almost 1,200 graduates that have come through that group home. I went on to college at 21, learned that I had dyslexia, used that as an excuse and dropped out. Came back here to Chicago and helped start the program City Year. And from City Year, I was asked to go to Columbus, Ohio to organize a group service project where many people were doing serve-a-thons. City Year wanted to do the same thing for their first convening called Syzygy. And instead of dispersing people out across the city, because in Columbus, where the conference was at, there was no public transportation. And everywhere where they've accomplished this before, they could send the volunteers out on public transportation and then reconvene them at the end of the day. It was going to be impossible to do that in Columbus, so we had to pick projects that could put a lot of people to work and have a definable project in a definable day. When I was at Ripon for the short time that I was there, my roommate across the hall, mother, got involved in a playground project here in Evanston, Illinois, called Penny Park, just up the road. And we were cheap labor to come down from Ripon to help build that on 2 consecutive weekends for free beer and pizza, and had a great time. And lots of people were involved. So when I was asked to organize the service project, I went back to that experience and said, why don't we build playgrounds? So City Year gave me the operating license, and in Columbus, for their first Syzygy conference, we had 1,200 volunteers build 2 playgrounds at Indianola Middle School and Emerald Glen, and it was a phenomenal experience. And I learned so much from that experience that actually I wanted to stay with City Year and ask them to let me do more of this in the future. But as an organization, frankly, focused on discipline, which was a lesson that I learned, they said no, because we operate a youth service corps. And this was in their first year of national expansion. And it just didn't fit what they were doing. So I moved to Washington, D.C., not knowing necessarily what I was going to be doing, living on a couch in a friend's apartment so you didn't have to pay rent, and trying to find somebody else to do another playground project with. Simultaneously, in August of that year, front page article in the Washington Post was written about Aisha and Clarendon, who were 2- and 4-year-old kids in Anacostia section of the Washington, D.C. neighborhood, who in the heat wave of that year, and if people don't remember, we had like 30 consecutive days above 100 degrees. Several hundred people died here in Chicago. And these 2 kids crawled into an abandoned car in their neighborhood with the windows rolled down and suffocated and died. And the first article was a very small, brief mention in the Metro section. And this one reporter was so, incensed about this, she went down there and wanted to cover more about it. And she spent weeks walking around the community, block by block by block, to try to find green space, a basketball court, a gymnasium, a boys and girls club, a park, let alone a playground. Nothing within 3 miles. So she writes this article with the headline, "No Place to Play," but the other part of the story was about how the finger pointing began. The property owner blamed the residents. The mayor blamed the housing authority. The housing authority blamed the Park and Rec department because they had a joint use agreement to provide recreation and nothing had ever happened. I took a cab down to the community to find the only person that I knew down there because, frankly, the reporter didn't return my phone call. And Karen Settles was the person quoted in the article. I knocked on her door and said, "Is there anything we can do to help?" And unfortunately, all she had was this pent-up anger and anxiety that she didn't know how to take outside help. But having built playgrounds in the past, seeing what the need could be here in this community, particularly if the need was not me building a playground for them, but me building a playground with them, we could actually both transform the civic voice and at the same time provide a safe and fun place for kids to recreate and have fun and the community to socialize in. Subsequently, I met the Enterprise Foundation. And the guy who was the president of the Enterprise Foundation, was the #2 man there, was my neighbor, lived a couple of doors down from me. And he would check in on me on this progress. And I tell this kind of deviation in the road because I didn't realize this until 10 years later. Yes, he was the president of the Enterprise Foundation. He was the first person to invite me into his office to actually hear my pitch about working in this Stoddard Terrace neighborhood. And he was willing to fund it because that fit their need. And then I asked him, because of the demand, if I wanted to start an organization, would you back me? Before I left that day, he wrote me a $50,000 check. Now, the funny and interesting part about that, Ray Ramsey, Ben Heck, and Alec Ross, I'll never forget their names, just like I'll never forget Aisha and Clarendon's name. 10 years later, I was telling the story 5 years ago at an Enterprise Foundation conference. And the then CEO, who was the CEO at the time of all this happening, said, "We funded you?" And Ray didn't ask for permission. If he ever got caught, he was going to ask for forgiveness. And he said, my job was to invest not just in ideas, but people. And literally, I was with Ray less than 10 days ago, still telling this story. And Ray would still tell you the same thing today. I didn't know if you could pull it off. But something about the perseverance that you had, I could see that it was a worthy investment to be made. And at the end of the day, all it was $50,000. Conversely, I had the opportunity to come to Chicago about the same time and meet with one of the heads of the fifth largest foundation in the country. You figure that out. And she said to me, as I was trying to convince her to work on this playground project at Stoddard Terrace, that by building a playground, we could build social capital And by building social capital, people would find their civic voice and potentially go on and do other amazing and incredible things. After a very short meeting, a couple of minutes, she stood up, came across her desk, patted me on the head, and said, at the end of the day, it's just a playground. Look at the two reactions that we got. So subsequently, in 1995, at 23 years old, I went about to build one playground after another playground. I would be lying and kidding if I were to tell you today that 15 years ago, I thought we would do this. I thought in the period of that time, we would mobilize over 1 million volunteers, impact 5.5 million kids, build 2,031 playgrounds as of today, and by the way, 3 are being built across the country with KaBOOM as I stand here and talk to you. And frankly, have come up with a public-private partnership model that have fueled and sustained us. In as much as my benevolence was, as I went out and told this story about Aisha and Clarendon and why there was a need in communities, I thought philanthropies and government would be what funded me. But also because of the Enterprise Foundation and Ray Ramsey, they invited me and paid for me to go to Miami, Florida, which was a major inconvenience, actually, but I went. And at that conference, serendipitously enough, the head of the Home Depot Foundation happened to be there. And she said, I don't know if this will work or not, but I think you have a lot in common with our co-founders, Bernie and Arthur. And at some point, you should probably meet them. When we went to San Antonio, Texas, Home Depot was opening a store there into a brand new market. They heard that we were building a playground with a 72-year-old woman, Ray Hood, because in her community at Coliseum Oaks, there was literally a railroad tracks that led between her side of town and the middle-income side of town. And the middle-income side of town had the playground that her kids had to walk over across the tracks to play on. After an ugly battle for 2 years, they erected a fence around the playground so that her kids couldn't get across the railroad tracks to play on it. Having attended every community meeting up to that point to say this isn't fair, this isn't right, this isn't just, she lost. But she didn't give up. She went down to the local Home Depot and said, can I get some lumber and some nails and possibly some of your people to come out and help me build a playground, a small one. And the store manager at that point had worked on our first and only playground we had done with Cityyear in Columbus, Ohio. And said, I don't know how to do it, but there's this other guy who does. I went to San Antonio, Texas, and worked with Home Depot and Ray Hood to build KaBOOM's actually first playground, while I was still trying to build the playground for Aisha and Clarendon. And going back just 1 second, remember they were 2 and 4. I was 2 and 4 when my father left my mother and when I went to a group home. And look at my circumstance and look at their circumstance. And I, just felt like this was just wrong for me to have what I got and for them not to get what I had. So in San Antonio, Texas, when we built this playground, Mrs. Hood, before she died at 80 years old, built 6 other playgrounds without us. And all the kids on the other side of the track went to her park instead of their park. And just this February, I was at the NBA All-Star game, and David Robinson came up to me, and he said, thank you for working with Ray Hood and building those playgrounds with her. And I said, the reality is, we built one playground with her, and she did all the rest on her own. She did all the rest on her own, but she was giving us credit for the work that she and her community were essentially doing. What that taught us back then was, as much as I'd like to be in nice foundation offices, they weren't going to fund this because I didn't have any history. One person actually told me, because not only did I not finish college, but because I hadn't gone to the right college, I wasn't going to get funding. But these corporations, long before employee volunteerism was important 15 years ago, which is now prevalent in almost every corporation, 15 years ago, nobody heard about it. We would move from community to community, building a singular playground. As luck would have it, I happened to be in a bar in Washington, D.C., having a drink. Guy pulls up next to me. He's an aspiring writer for a magazine called Who Cares, as an unpaid intern during college. We hit it up. I tell him what we're accomplishing, doing, about Aisha and Clarendon, our experience in San Antonio, Texas. He goes back and bangs out the most eloquent article about what we were trying to accomplish that got cut down to 2 sentences and 17 words in a future edition of Who Cares magazine. That guy is actually Chuck Schofield, who's the #2 man at Share Our Strength these days under Billy Shore, and has actually ghostwritten many books called Revolution of the Heart, Cathedral Within, and that 17 words, those 2 sentences, somehow ended up on the president of the Kimberly-Clark's Corporation's desk, who I think his wife got it, gave it to him, he circled it, sent it to the head of corporate communications, and said, with our impending anniversary coming up, is there something we can do with this? We were a $70,000 organization at that time. We were in Dallas, Texas, with a very nervous corporation talking about how they wanted to do 10 playgrounds. That was a big deal. So they said, but the way we're going to do it is we're going to send out a fax to our mill communities and ask them if they wanted to volunteer, #1, and if they wanted to volunteer, would they be interested in building a playground? December 1st, the fax went out, long before email. By December 4th, 7 had already come in. I was getting nervous, and you think Kimberly-Clark wasn't nervous? By the deadline, 100% of their mill towns, 37 to be exact, said they wanted to build a playground for the anniversary. Tina Berry, at the time, said, somehow I think you're going to be able to pull it off, and gave us a check for $2.7 million. Long before we had a permanent office, long, frankly, before we even had a bank account. Actually. And we did it. We did it. Jamie talked about relationships. 14 years later, Tina Berry leaves Kimberly-Clark and is contemplating a job at Dr. Pepper Snapple. And she calls me up and says, obviously this company has issues, but if I went to this company, would you work with us? And I said, yeah, because it's you, we'll give it a shot. But we'll only do it on certain conditions. And the conditions being, you write a check, your employees participate, and you live your values, which means that you also have to look at things like product formulation and stuff like that. A nonprofit telling a for-profit that will take your money if you do these things. She gives us $500,000. She gives us $1 million, now $1.5 million. We meet with the CEO, and he says, we're really committed to both being a responsible company with our products and with our people, and they're improving their products. And we want you to know that. Like, he's accountable to us. And then he writes a check for $15 million. Interestingly enough, I know Seth was here this morning, he's a dear friend, and everything he said is absolutely right. And one of the challenges as a leader that I have is that I love to work with the Honest Teas of the world and the Honest Kids of the world and the Stonyfield Farms of the world, they don't have the resources to back us. They don't make the margin to support a minimum payment to $75,000 to do a singular playground building. So the trade-off is that some of these endemic, responsible brands who basically own and earn their reputation don't have to do things big in a way with us. So we have to go another way. And for 15 years, because the pats on the heads were nice, but wasn't getting us anywhere, corporate America, and almost 349 of them, have funneled $200,000 into what we do. The first thing is you got to know your cost. And if you know what your costs are, you got to be able to tell people what it costs and make them pay for it. I remember an early example, a corporation came to us and said, we've got $50,000 to build a playground. And I said it cost $70,000 at the time. And they said, well, just downsize it. I said, it costs $70,000, that's what our model is. 2 weeks later, they came back with $70,000. We've also had instances where people have frankly walked away. Planters Peanuts is an example. They gave $1 million and they wanted 20 playgrounds done. Guess what? The organization they gave it to had never built a playground before. They wanted 20 ones done 2 years later. If you know what your costs are and you cover your costs, and actually you're going to hear this afternoon from Lisa at the Calvert Foundation. She was talking this morning literally about if you know what your margin is, you'll be able to accomplish your mission. And if you know what your costs are, you can actually put margin on top of that. KaBOOM has margin built into what we do, because if we're working with company X and the demand is greater than what we supply, we want company X to actually help us diffuse the demand by sharing free know-how-to information to anybody else in an open source way to support that. Two other things. One, about 6 years ago, we were getting 14,000 requests for 200 playgrounds that we were building. And there was no way that's what scale meant to us was more offices, more people, more overhead, chapters or affiliates, size of budget or staff, which, talking about measurement, that's what everybody else was asking us. What's your scaling plan? And we'd say, reaching more communities to be able to self-organize to do this. No. How many more offices are you going to have across the country? How many more people are you going to have? Not what impact you were going to get out of more offices and more people. So we started this very risky venture to actually open source all the intellectual property that we've ever gleaned by working with the communities that we had worked with up to that point, and put it online and gave it away free, to the terror and horror of both us and everybody else. In the time since we've done that, thousands of playgrounds have been built online without KaBOOM being there, including last year, 900 alone. And today, if you go on the Playground Planner site, as I did this morning, and I know that 3 KaBOOM ones are working across the country, 11, because of that planner, are working. We've scaled. We've scaled using the internet. Now, in those 11 other projects that are happening, not a KaBOOM project manager, there's not a KaBOOM logo or banner, we're not in the press release. Do we care? My ego's not hurt, my team's ego's not hurt. We are about the cause, not the credit. And if you're about the credit, as unfortunately sometimes our ego drives us to be, you make very different decisions. If you fundamentally become about the cause, you make very different decisions. At the same point in our history, we became the largest purchaser of playgrounds in the United States. And we asked ourselves, should we not just be building more playgrounds, but better playgrounds? Shouldn't we take that and make it a market maker? And started to use our influence with manufacturers to try to change design. To try to change getting kids to play harder, play longer, and want to play more frequently, which would fundamentally help them with their social, emotional, cognitive development. Make them more ready and more prepared for academic learning and success. Get them to be intrinsically motivated around physical activity and movement instead of extrinsically having to be rewarded to actually move. And in the landscape, what we saw and what we were building was good, but it was not best in class. So as Seth alluded to this morning, being a nonprofit is nice and necessary, and I'm not knocking nonprofits. It's really hard, as he talked about, and Jason used the statistic of, on average, $20 to raise 100, versus in the for-profit world, $4 to raise that same 100. It takes an engine and a machine to constantly be out there raising money for your cause. In the for-profit world, if you have a good product, and the product continues to sell itself with the right margin, it allows you your own path and destiny at your own control. And we started this joint venture with David Rockwell in New York to actually make these loose parts, 180 of them, put in carts and boxes that can be shipped to daycare centers, museums, schools, backyards, and started a social enterprise that in a very short period of time has already done $3 million worth of business, distributing over 300 units across the country. Completely sustainable, scalable, and if it scales, we have two options with it. If the multiplier is right for it at the right time, we'd sell it to raise revenue for KaBOOM and possibly put it in an endowment to raise some of our annually get some of our operating budget from that. We could invest in new products and services. I think one of the points we've got to mention there is about social enterprise. The enterprise means that money. But what's the social side of it mean? And do they fit together? You know, the social side of Imagination Playground could mean that it's more and better type of play for kids. But how do you then get that into the low-income, underserved type of communities whose kids probably need it more? That's what makes the social side of it. Tom's Shoes is a model. Buy one, give one, right? But at $100, you can see how that works. But at $10,000 or $20,000, you can see why it wouldn't work. So we're excited about this venture and trying to grow it fast, create a different narrative and conversation about what's the best type of play for kids, and push it down into more communities, particularly the communities like Aisha and Clarendon live in. Do we make a difference? Most of what we know is anecdotal, to be quite honest. It's the Ray Hood stories, it's the Juanita Hatton in Philadelphia that 3 days after waking up and having built the playground in Nicetown of Philadelphia, she went out and the playground had been vandalized. And as an hourly worker in a hotel, she initially wanted to call me angry. She called in sick. She went across the street, scrubbed off the graffiti, because as she told me then, she didn't want the kids to come home from school and see the playground that her community and her parents built with graffiti on it. This happened multiple times throughout the course of a couple of months. And she'd call in sick. And she'd go out there and scrub the graffiti because she didn't want the kids to see graffiti on the playground their moms and dad built. About 4 months ago, I had happened to be in Philadelphia to celebrate the playground's 14th birthday. And it looks newer than what it does when we actually built it, because they've added a garden, a mural, they've added trees. Just yesterday, I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with the mayor from Braddock, Pennsylvania, who look up Stephen Colbert's, the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, and watch his interview. Watch his interview from where he talks about a town that in the 1955 had 14, it was only 20,000 people and only 2.5 square miles. It had 14 furniture stores, 16 restaurants, 3 dry cleaners. And today, in every single one of those categories, has absolutely 0. This is a kid who grew up in New York, went on to Harvard Business School, but wanted to go back through AmeriCorps, planting gardens, being stationed in this community, and then running for mayor to be elected and reelected to try to reverse a trend. Somehow he finds out about us. We're able to work with him to build a playground. Just yesterday, when we were talking about this, to see how that playground has now moved into $2.5 million for a community center. Street light improvements on the street. And to both of our amazement, a woman in the audience stood up who had grown up in the community and talked about, when she was a child, the playgrounds that she got to play on. And she said, my grandchild lives there now, and she plays on this playground. And we were almost ready to move out of town because it wasn't very child-friendly. And to see what the ripple effect in the sense of the momentum and inertia that this playground created from a definable project on a definable timeline has been absolutely stunning and amazing. I could go on and tell you stories about that community impact, but I think the bottom line is Public-Private Ventures, one of the leading impact evaluating firms out of Philadelphia, was hired by the Knight Foundation to actually say, does KaBOOM make a difference? And they looked at, are we able to organize communities around a common cause, a definable playground on a definable timeline? Can we break up the project in achievable wins so that the community and a broad set of communities can do little things that add up to the successful completion of a playground project? And after the playground project, is there any cascading steps of courage and leadership? And if so, exactly what is it? The first thing that they said about it was that of all the organizations that they've studied, there's such a rigor of discipline about collecting data in KaBOOM. It was easy to actually do their study because there was actually data there. The second thing that they said, more impressively, I believe, is that in our 35 years of existence, we have not seen an organization that just had incremental impact, but exponential impact, as we have in KaBOOM. No, we're not Teach for America. No, we're not City Year. But the difference that we're making in finding people's civic voice, and from that civic voice, them getting a street light fixed, or as PPV found a story for us that we didn't even know about. Single mother on a planning committee in East Lansing, Michigan. Never had been involved in community service in her community before. Gets involved in the playground, becomes the playground monitor after the playground is built, runs for school board and loses. 4 years later, runs for school board again and wins. We didn't know that existed. And all the other stories of the million people. Now that's from the community side, from the corporate side too. There's transformation that takes place in the leadership at corporations about what they see as possible, both within their own people. And these things take time. Last story I want to tell you is about one of my favorite, Ben & Jerry's. We started working with Ben & Jerry's because when I moved to Washington, D.C., one of my friends from City Year was the manager of a local franchise operation. When we were trying to build the Stoddard Terrace playground, she gave me ice cream to take down to that community to actually sell so that they could raise money for their project. The second year, because that playground hadn't been built yet, for Free Cone Day, and as Ben & Jerry celebrates across the country on their birthday, give out ice cream. She collected donations for the Stoddard Terrace playground project, and we raised over $8,000. The third year, she told at a franchise advisory meeting about the work this organization was doing called KaBOOM, and other franchisees wanted to do something. So we made a brochure called How to Save Play in Your Community, and 67 franchisees distributed it in their stores all across the country. The fourth year, the franchisees voted to build a playground for their franchisees' annual meeting, where they convene every single year. The fifth year, Ben & Jerry's came to us and said, our people love what you do, but we cannot write you a check big enough to do what we want to do for you. I was devastated. But they said, the best thing that we have is an ice cream. And we're going to name our first ever, and up until 2 years, their only flavor for a nonprofit organization called KaBOOM, a blueberry strawberry ice cream with white fudge covered Pop Rocks. Exploded in your mouth, KaBOOM! And that raised enough money to build 7 playgrounds across the country. More so than if I asked them for money, than they could have written a check for. And more so that it took 5 years to actually get it. The guy who ran the operation at that time, Bruce Bowman, who was Ben & Jerry's right-hand guy, now runs KaBOOM as the chief operating officer and has for the last 6 years. The CMO of Ben & Jerry's, who ran Snapple, was the chair of our board. We're in a relationship business, Jamie. We're not in a transactional point of view here. It's relevant to you because if I can do it, coming where I came from and seeing where other people have come from like me, certainly you sitting out there doing what you're doing, committed to what you're already committed to, can certainly do what Wendy Kopp have done, Michael and Alan Brown have done, and what Darell Hammond have done. And I look forward to coming back in a shorter period of time than 13 years or 10 years or 7 years to see the incredible impact that you all have. You don't have to start something, but everything you touch, make better. And what I mean by that is, I have an MBA student who works at KaBOOM. And initially he told me after getting out of MBA school, he wanted to be a social entrepreneur. It was really important for him to start something. It was really important for him to have that title because he chose to go into the social sector, unlike all of his other friends who went into the business sector, who at some point in their career was going to come back because the time was going to be right. That MBA student's still working for us, making more money than most of his colleagues, and have had better experiences in terms of developing his personal and professional skills than most of his colleagues who went to consumer products companies or whatever. The time is never going to be right, folks. And there's always going to be a better opportunity out there. Whatever opportunity you choose, make the best of it today. And if you do that, I surely think that you'll both have a lot of fun and make an incredible difference. So I look forward to talking with you and answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Questions? Really, no questions after that? Who wants to build a playground for Santa next year?
The funny story is, I can't tell you, on the Ben & Jerry's piece, so Unilever acquired the company, and the ice cream was done right in the period of which any contract that Ben & Jerry's signed had to be reviewed by Unilever's lawyers. Some conservative lawyer sitting in the UK for Unilever was reading the contract and went to KaBOOM.com, and we were KaBOOM.org, and unfortunately it was a very raunchy lesbian green card company. And he totally thought and was convinced Ben & Jerry's was trying to screw Unilever, literally and figuratively, with this ice cream as they were exiting. And I've got more stories like that than you would ever know. Or I can tell you about, my wife loves this story. I happened to be at a playground build with the CEO, and I was going back to Washington, D.C. that night. He was going to New York. And he said, let me give you a ride to the airport. Absolutely. He was going on his private plane. I was going on a commercial airline. And the airport that he was going to was not the airport I was going to. But I was going back on his private plane to New York and then to D.C. later, and landed with $1 million check. Oh, one other story I want to tell you real quick. Talk about audacity, I love this one. This happened in Chicago. Some of my best days, I consider myself from Chicago. So we were working with a major philanthropist who I won't name so they're not embarrassed. But his consultant told us, ask for $250,000. My board said, if you want $250,000, ask for $500, because you're not going to get it. We had a meeting set up in a hotel downtown. The guy was running late. And you know, our senior director and I were talking around and said, why don't we just ask for $1 million? If it's this arbitrary, why not? So the guy comes into the meeting and says, I'm really sorry I'm late, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to stay. He said, but what do you need? And I said, $10 million. And he said, I can't do 10, but I'll give you 5, and I'll work with you to raise the rest. The point that I learned out of that, was, if somebody ever asks you what you need, you better tell them, because you just may get it. Yeah, go ahead.
Early in KaBOOM's trajectory, you had a lot of success with corporate funders, and you sort of talked about how it came out of nowhere. How did you get in front of some of those people early on? I think you talked about one example. And were those future opportunities connected, or were they all different, how you got the opportunities to tell your story?
Yeah, great question. So the Home Depot happened because Enterprise put me in front of Suzanne Apple, who put me in front of their founders. Well, I hit it off with Bernie and Arthur, partly because they were coming to visit us in Washington, D.C. I was in shared office space with Children's Defense Fund and Stand for Children. The founders of Home Depot, this hip and up and coming, we had 300 stores across the country, and every economic development department in the country asking them to come to their city. They were coming to Washington, D.C. to speak at a BSR conference. And my office was right across the street, so they arranged to do a stop-by. They were going to be there less than 5 minutes. We pulled in 8 phone lines to that office, had 3 volunteers, and then told all of our friends to call us. Just repetitively, just call. So when these 2 guys were there, the phones were ringing off the hook like it was a telephone. And years later, when they wrote their book, Built from Scratch, they talked about when they opened up their first Home Depot store, they went to Sears and stole all their cardboard boxes of Craftsman tools and actually stocked it behind their boxes, so it made their warehouse look fuller than what it was. And then they said, and then this entrepreneur did the same thing from the social side, and we knew we liked him because he was on the same game they were on. So the way we got into the other folks was that, you know, I'm big into slow growth. And probably not always that way, right? It was more of a shotgun approach. And we were probably robbing from Peter to pay Paul. It's like, you got a big sponsor, take care of him. Well, the mentality was, you got a big sponsor, who's your next big sponsor, right? And our point, what we had to learn as we went along, because what Suzanne Apple told me one day was, she called me up on a Friday night, and she said, we got a problem in Vancouver, and I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. And I jumped on a plane, went to Vancouver, averted whatever problem it was, and frankly, I don't even remember what it was. And I remember vividly her telling me, I left her a message on Saturday night saying, I'm heading home, everything is fine. Monday morning, she called me and said, the problem is bigger than the problem in Vancouver, it's that you got to go solve it. And she sent me a book called Fly to the Buffalo. And it was all about the charismatic personality of a leader, not necessarily the depth of a management team. and processes and procedures within an organization that make you reliable, predictable, and consistent. And so we very methodically, to keep Home Depot, had to reverse engineer what we were doing and do things differently, which meant that our strategy became fewer, larger, longer-term sponsors. Now in 2000, it worked up until 2008, when the economy dropped and we lost $9.7 million of money under contract, because of the recession. Washington Mutual, Lehman Brothers, Chrysler, Fannie Mae, you name it. Picking up the Wall Street Journal every day, it was like, what's going to evaporate now? And at that point, we weren't very diversified. So we went down about 22% in revenue. And fortunately, this year, we've exceeded where we were at in 2008. If you underpromise and overdeliver, it's amazing how other things happen. Just like the Tina Berry situation happened from Kimberly Clark to Dr. Pepper Snapple, that's happened from Home Depot executives who now run 24-hour fitness. And it's like, we got to do something with KaBOOM. The other thing I would say is that to some degree, we got reactive instead of proactive. And we let our phones ring about people who wanted to work with us. And we hired a Kellogg alum from 2000, Dan Cohen, to come in and lead a much more surgical, proactive, strategic outreach to say, whose brand do we want to be associated with, and how do we get in front of them, instead of waiting for our phone to ring, and then be in front of incredible organizations and corporations, but not necessarily the ones who are mission-fit partners that can carry our brand extension further faster.
Hello, thanks for sharing your stories. You mentioned improving the quality of play. What learnings in the time that you've started KaBOOM have you learned about how kids play, maybe how kids should play? Are there any things that you didn't expect in the actual play arena, so to speak?
Yeah, you know, T. Barry Brazelton, who's one of the leading thought leaders on what it means to be a child in childhood, how do we parent them, the cultural norms associated with it, has recently said that childhood has probably changed more in just the last decade, probably the last 5 years, than in the last 2 centuries. And things like technology certainly plays a part, single-family parenting, divorces, just a plethora of things are compressing how the normalization of kids are being raised in our societies, not just here in North America, but certainly across the world. And obviously there are cultural differences in the world anyway about childhood. What we have to do a better job of actually is demonstrating that poster that we always saw, that everything I learned in kindergarten, was not just a poster, it's actually more true than we ever knew it to be, because brain research is finally starting to empirically prove that. Out of the University of Washington, they're now able to look at the plasticity of the brain and what happens during both different activities, particularly like creative activities, the pursuit of creative activities, health and exercise, emotional relationships, and track people through 0 to 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 to 12. And what was always thought was that by the time 5 and 6 years old, the neurons that fire stop firing. And they start to tunnel to make connections, nodes. And 90-some-odd% of that happens before the age of 6. Before the age of 6. What we certainly see culturally is that parents still want the best for their kids, but what sometimes they think the best for their kids is a singular activity, like a pursuit of arts or ballet or piano, or a singular pursuit of sports. Instead of participating in 3 sports a year, they participate in 1 sport 3 seasons. So attendance has gone up in sports at like 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old, but drops dramatically at 6, 7, 8, and 9, because kids tell you they're burnt out, they're bored. We have to remember that Michael Jordan didn't start playing basketball until he was 16 years old. Now, if you're not considered on the track by 16 years old, you've probably already lost out. And so the research is catching up with it, but I also just think that it's a cultural norm. And to somehow we've been painting this picture that it's an either or instead of an and. That it's either academic attainment and success or creativity, imagination. It's, to me, not surprising that Finland, on almost any measure academically, is 1, 2, or 3. Finland has a play-based curriculum that looks at, for every hour you're in school, 15 minutes of that has to be outside in unstructured activities. So if you're in school 7 hours, every hour you get 15 minutes of outside creative, even during the winters. Yet they're 1, 2, and 3. And what are we, 14th in reading, 17th in science, 24th in math? Something's not working here. And again, it's not an either or, it's an and. And the and is that the best type of play for kids, particularly the youngest kids, is much more creativity, expression, manipulation, sand and water. And as adults, as all of us are becoming different cycles of adults, we can't stop playing either. Because as we become parents, we either provide the provision for this type of outlet, or we provide the provision to tunnel and track them. And I think we really have to think about that. KaBOOM doesn't pretend to be the playground or the play expert. But what we've committed to is using our platform, particularly with corporate America, to try to get this agenda on more people's, this issue on more people's agenda. So doing things like asking our sponsors to hold instant recess at their corporations, around 10 minutes of creative expression in their corporations, or bringing Playworks, another like-minded organization, to people's visibility. Some people would see that as competition. But if there's not a field built around this, and the tide rises, and KaBOOM's the only boat in there and we're a big boat, we're still not going to do everything that's going to be needed and necessary. So we're very much focused on more broader leadership and trying to support interesting and potentially incremental organizations doing incredible work. Lots of research on our website, and I can go through stats like kids only live with, 1 in 5 kids live within a mile to a park. Kids are under the age of 10 are getting 7.5 hours of screen time. If you're low income and minority, that goes up to like 12 hours. Minority kids, the average statistic is 1 in 3 kids under the age of 10 are not just overweight but obese. But again, if you're a minority, it goes to 2 in 3 kids, with Hispanics being the fastest growing population in the country, and it's 2 in 3 kids under 5 years old. And if you think we've got an obesity problem now, we're going to have a bigger problem in just 5 and 10 years. And I'm not, again, saying that play is the only way, but certainly it's this cultural behavior thing that is indicative of other things that we need to do. If we firmly believed in this, would we build schools while we're trying to encourage kids to walk to school without sidewalks? We do. So, maybe just like the ADA law around accessibility, not saying you need a play law, but there's got to be something around the built environment for us to actually talk about these subjects. Just recently, last Sunday's Chicago Sun-Times was talking about the play deficit in Chicago. That there are 2 issues. Access to parks here in the city is, 1 per, I can't remember what the number was, and 2, that the quality of the parks is substantially less than what it needs to be. And the example that they brought up was a park on the west side of Chicago. If you go to the Park District site, you pull up what the photo of it looks like, it is as it was built. So you jaunt down there thinking you're going to encounter this experience, and it's something 30 years old that's almost closed down. So, as an organization, we have to continue to focus in technology that lowers the barriers to entry, but that also gets people online to do things offline, and for people offline to report what they've done online from a learning and continuous improvement and growing the movement perspective. One more? Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the MBA student not making more than his business counterparts. I mean, that's generally not what's thought of as a nonprofit versus for-profit.
You know, he was making $30,000 less out of school, and now he's making more. The comparable set, he went to Duke. People did not rise as fast as ours rose because of the economy dropping. If you read our 990, it lists everybody now that makes above $100,000. And we have several people who do. We pay for talent. Not only do we pay for talent, I think we have one of the most progressive nonprofit bonus programs that look at both professional development, team goals, and organizational goals across the organization. So we incent collective and individual improvement in performance, just like Seth does, but not in stock options. And by the way, Jason, it cost us 4 cents to raise the dollars that we raise. Our whole G&A is 12% of our budget, which in most nonprofits it's 28%, 28 to 32. So we're incredibly efficient and lean at what we're able to accomplish. Hey, thank you. I look forward. I'm going to be around here.